Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on fixing workplace conflict. This is a cheerful subject today where we're going to be talking about how to manage conflict in the workplace. So I appreciate you all being here and looking forward to chatting with you about this topic and appreciate your interest. My name is Chris Sheasley, and I am a professional mediator. My focus is on organizational conflict and helping people within organizations figure out how to work together when things are difficult and when they're having a challenging working relationship. So basically, I fix the worst conflicts that organizations produce. So this is what I do for a living, and I've been stopped counting at about 2,000 cases and 25 years of work. In fact, here I have a picture of me in a recent case here. This is an example, a fictitious example, the kind of stuff I get into as a professional mediator in workplaces. So I wanted to kind of work through the outcomes for today's session. There are 5 things we're going to be doing together. And the first of those is to develop kind of an appreciation for the upside of conflict to help you be more constructive in how you approach this topic. A lot of people are kind of allergic to conflict and have some reservations about dealing with conflict. So my hope is to help you all have a different perspective an hour from now on conflict resolution and the concept of conflict. So that's kind of one of the key things I want to do with you all today. The next thing is to talk about the different options that you have and kind of the 3 pillars of good conflict resolution, if you will. So this is a chance for you all to think about your different options and kind of the different approaches that you can take to have an effective outcome in a conflict situation. The next 3 are to help you recognize this idea of underlying interest. I'm going to give you all if you've seen the movie The Matrix, I'm going to give you all the blue pill here so you can see the other side of conflict, or kind of think of it as X-ray goggles. When you put them on, you'll be able to kind of see through any conflict and look at a deeper insight so you can move beyond stuck and impasse conflict. The 4th thing is to talk about some key mind sets that you can have when dealing with conflict situations so you can be more effective in listening during conflict. I know it's difficult for most folks to really stay in that listening mode during conflict, so we're going to talk about one key idea that will help you be more effective in listening in conflict scenarios. And then finally, give you a chance to plan how to take these skills and use them in your work world. So to begin, I want to give you all an opportunity to weigh in here and share your thoughts on how you all are affected by conflict. So I have a little poll here for you, and we have 4 options. So how impacted are you all by conflict in your organizations? So that's the question, and a scale from 1 to 4. So 1, very impacted. So that's kind of the Armageddon. Things are difficult, and there's a lot of conflict in your work world, all the way down to 4, which is kind of a perpetual Woodstock where everybody's getting along and everything's going well all the time. So where do you all lay on that scale? We'll open up the poll here and give you a chance to share your thoughts on that.
So it looks like for this poll, we have 18% are very impacted, 57% are somewhat impacted, and 23% less impacted, 5% are not impacted at all.
Okay, great. Thank you for letting us know. So it sounds like we're leaning towards the 1 and 2. If we kind of average those out, sounds like we're kind of up in that zone. And clearly from the very low percentage on the not impacted at all, those 5% of you, boy, I wish I could come work with your company and be a part of that organization, because that's a rare phenomenon not to have much conflict at all in organizations. So that kind of gets us started in thinking about this idea of how much conflict is around us throughout our organizational life. So a couple more questions for you, 2 more polls, in fact. So the next one is about your comfort with conflict. So this is about you personally, the first one about your organization. As you think about how well you are in your dealings with conflict, I'd like you to share your thoughts on this. So number 1, obviously, you're extremely comfortable and can't wait to get into your next conflict, all the way down to rather have a root canal than even think about dealing with a conflict. So again, we'll give you a moment to answer, and then Brenda can share the results that we see.
Wow, so it looks like 12% would rather have a root canal, 35% are not comfortable, 34% are less comfortable, and 20% are somewhat comfortable.
Okay, great. Well, again, I appreciate you all being honest and sharing your thoughts on that. You're certainly typical of groups that I work with on this topic of conflict, that it's not comfortable for most people, and so it's you're in the norm and as far as being on that uncomfortable end of the scale. So again, one of my goals for us today is to help you all gain some comfort. So I hope if we were to do this poll at the end of our time together here, that you might have shifted 1 point on this scale so you can have some additional confidence and comfort dealing with conflict situations. All right, so grand finale in our polls. The next question is your effectiveness. So the first question was about the organization, second question about your personal comfort with it, and this grand finale question is how effective you feel in dealing with conflict. So again, the scale is 1 very effective all the way down to 4 not effective at all in your efforts to deal with other conflicts.
So it looks like we have 5% as being very effective, 52% somewhat effective, 33% less effective, and 10% are not effective at all.
Okay, great. Well, good. Thank you again. And sounds like there's a fair amount of tilt here towards the very effective and somewhat effective. So it sounds like many of you are here today to gain some additional skills and enhance your conflict resolution. And clearly, some of you, also a large percent, have some concerns about how effective you are in the face of conflict. So hopefully this gives us kind of a grounding and a place to start in the conversation around conflict and your own relationship to this concept. As I mentioned at the very beginning, one of the goals here is to give you a different perspective about the whole concept of conflict. So we're gonna do a quick word game here. So this is the kind of word game where I give you a word, and I'd like you to, if you have a pen and paper handy, just jot down some words that come to mind when you see this word that I'm going to put up on the screen in a moment. So the question for you all is, as you see this concept, jot down all the words that come to mind, just stream of consciousness as quickly as you can, jot down as many words as you can around this word. So 3, 2, 1, and the word is, surprise, conflict. So what words come to mind when you see conflict? I'll give you a couple moments to jot down some thoughts. Okay, so assuming you've jotted down a number of words, I'm going to ask you to analyze your list here a little bit. If you're typical of what most folks do when I ask them to do this thought experiment, the words you came up with were things like war, fight, argument, clash, anger, frustration, and other words that are typically negative. So as we look at your list, again, if you're typical of most folks, you'll come up with a list that's probably overwhelmingly negative in terms of your conception of conflict. And that's a way of getting kind of a thermometer reading from you all about your relationship with conflict and your sense of what conflict is really about. But I'd like to challenge you a little bit and think about the list that you created there and come up with kind of another perspective on it. I'd like to ask you to consider, have you been in a conflict in the last month? Have you been in a conflict in the last week? Perhaps you've been in a conflict in the last 24 hours or having a conflict right now with somebody sitting next to you. So if that's the case, and I suspect for most of you, you would have been able to relate to this idea of having been in conflict recently, that anything that happens to that many people that often is what? It's normal, it's a part of life, it's something that happens to all of us all the time. And so I'd like to make the argument that conflict is actually, because it's a normal part of life, it's even a healthy part of life. Because let's imagine the alternative here, that we have created a world with no conflict at all. So tomorrow we wake up and we find on the front page of newspapers across the world, world peace breaks out. And there's peace everywhere, and everybody's getting along, and there's just no more conflict. We've abolished conflict from the world. for a moment that might sound attractive, but if you really start to analyze it, I'd like to ask you to think about it from a different perspective, and that is, what have we really created here? What do we lose if we don't have conflict in the world or in our organizations or in our lives? So it's with that in mind that I'd like to suggest that we've created a negative utopia if we've abolished conflict. And here for the first time, I'm going to invite you all to take a look at your handouts. There's materials there that are available to you. And Brenda maybe can explain how to get to that material.
Yeah, if you're in the GoToWebinar panel interface and you go down to under questions, there's a handout pane, and there should be an RBH workbook. It's a PDF of fixing workplace conflict, and you can just drag that and save it to your computer.
Okay, great, thank you. So
you're welcome.
As you pull down that document, you all will see that there are some fill in the blanks here, and we're going to walk you through those here in a moment. The question that I'm raising for you all is a different perspective on conflict. We've determined that it's something that happens to a lot of people often, that it's a normal part of life, and I would argue even a healthy part of life, because not to have conflict is really creating a world that lacks some important features of our development. And the first of those, and this is in the materials you can fill on the blank here, the first one is that it increases our awareness of a problem. So if you think about the conflicts that you've encountered, that you've been a part of, that you've seen around you, if you think about it in terms of, it's kind of like the yellow light on the dashboard of your car. It's flashing and it tells you something's wrong with the engine, something needs attention. And so I encourage folks to think about conflict in the same way, that it's kind of a light that's shining in our world and in our life and says there's something that needs attention. We need to pay attention to it. If we didn't have that, of course, we just drive the car until the car falls apart and never get it serviced. So that's one attribute of conflict, is it raises our awareness of the concern and focuses attention on something that's important. The second is this idea of an incentive to change. Again, if you think about the world without conflict, then it's a place where people aren't really making progress, you're not developing, and there's no incentive to do anything different than what we've already done. So, by that standard, we'd still be kind of living in caves. So this idea of conflict as a driver for change is very important as well. The next one is this idea of relationships. So I'm sure all of you can think about relationships that have been destroyed as a result of conflict, and people come up with those right away. I think that you were probably looking and thinking about those as you started developing your list of words around the word conflict. But how many of you have actually had a relationship that's been strengthened as a result of conflict? And I'm sure you can all think of one of those scenarios as well. The thing is, we focus on the negative one, the destruction of relationships around conflict, and we kind of ignore this idea that conflict can actually strengthen relationships. To quote my favorite singer, Bob Dylan, he says, strange how people who suffer together have stronger connections than people that are most content. And so it is with conflict, that we actually can enhance relationships and strengthen them through good management of the conflict. Two more concepts here. One is this idea that it actually helps us develop personally. So all of us listening to this call and participating in this webinar have improved ourselves through the constructive management of conflict. So we've all been able to enhance conflict and ourselves by dealing and managing conflict effectively. So you're a better person because you've dealt with conflicts in a constructive way. And the last thing is that conflict can be stimulating for some people. That's not true for everybody, of course, but it can be stimulating and kind of help us do things, and it's certainly a good fuel for the engine of change and personal development, all of those things that helps us make progress and move forward. So these are all important concepts that are underscore this idea that conflict really isn't so bad after all. So part of my social mission as a conflict resolution professional and a mediator is to help people think of this alternative perspective, that conflict doesn't need to be something scary and that we try to shy away from. reflecting back on the poll we did just a bit ago in terms of your thoughts about conflict and rather having a root canal and people that kind of lean towards that end of the spectrum, well, conflict actually can be a productive thing. So what I'd like to suggest in closing this section out is that you all actually didn't really follow my assignment when I asked you to think about the concept of conflict. What I suspect you did was think more about how conflict was mismanaged and has been mismanaged around you and in your own experiences with conflict. That you talked and answered that question about how conflict has been mismanaged rather than the concept of conflict itself. Conflict itself is ultimately a neutral concept, and it can go either way depending on how you handle it. And it's with that in mind that we're going to turn to better ways to approach conflict and be more effective with conflict in your work world, and you can even take these skills home, of course, too. So I hope that I've converted a couple of you, or at least put you up a notch on the scale of your relationship to conflict when you recognize that it has these potential positive attributes. So let's continue our journey then and taking this foundational concepts and moving towards a more concrete and skills that can help you be effective with conflict. To do that, we're going to do another poll here. I'd like to invite you to consider this question. I'm sorry, this isn't actually a poll, it's just a question for you all. And in your workbooks, if you have that pulled up, you can see that there's a blank line here. So the question is that conflicts typically occur within blank types of relationships. I've given you lots of different options here to select from. I'd like you to take a look at that list and consider which word seems to fit. And there isn't one that says all of the above, though you might be tempted to think that way. I want you to kind of focus in on a particular attribute of conflict that you'll see on this list here. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to check one of these off in your mind. The one I wanted to draw your attention to was this one, that conflict typically occurs within interdependent relationships. And for me, this is a kind of a radical concept when I was first introduced to this idea, because it suggests the following, that every conflict you've ever been in or ever will be in, your nemesis at work, the person you find most frustrating, the person that you think is out to get you, all of those attributes and all the things we ascribe to that person, the reason that we have that kind of level of frustration and angst about that person is that we're actually dependent on that person for something. So again, this idea of interdependence, we depend on them for something and they probably depend on us for something. And I think the reason that's so radical is that it's hard to see that, it's hard to sense that interdependence, that sense that we actually rely on them in the heat of conflict. And it's important to recognize this because if you ignore that fact, then you are much less effective in wanting and being motivated to resolve the conflict. I've never had a conflict with most of you on this line because I haven't met you, I haven't worked with you, I don't depend on you, and vice versa. But it's the people that I interact with, just ask my wife or my business partners or people I work with, those are the people I end up having conflict with because we're dependent on each other for things. So carrying that idea even further, think about this question as well. So where does conflict come from? So similarly here, the answer is that it comes from interaction. So it's a related concept to interdependence, but it just kind of takes us a little deeper into that concept that in order to have conflict, you have to both be interdependent with that person and you have to have some relationship with them as well. So with those concepts in mind, I want to take you to the next level here, which is to consider the different dimensions of conflict and how you can be successful in resolving it. And to be successful in resolving it, first of all, to summarize here, you take a look at what the benefits of conflict are. Don't be afraid of it. Know that there can be some value in the conflict. The next level is to recognize that you have something to gain by working through the conflict with most of the people that you end up in conflict with because you are dependent on each other for something important. So where I'd like to take you next is, and again, those of you looking at your handouts will see that there's this conflict resolution triangle. and that there are really three dimensions to any conflict situation. And the first of these is the problem. So if you're filling in the blanks there, it's to the right of the triangle in your handout. The P stands for the problem. And this one is the part that most people focus on when they're dealing with the conflict situation. They tend to innately and easily recognize what the problem is, and they are focused primarily on trying to solve that problem. So this is the tangible thing that we're fighting about when we're in conflict with each other. And you can imagine in workplace scenarios that people have lots of things that they fight about. In my experience, it's things like how they communicate, the mode of communication, the frequency of communication, the tone of the communication when they're communicating. That's kind of one dimension. It might be job roles and responsibilities, the task at hand, the reporting structure. It might be more tangible things yet, like money or noise coming from somebody's cubicle. So those are the kinds of things that often come up in terms of the problem. They're really the obvious, tangible parts that we can see and touch and feel and are divisible. So that's one part of the problem and conflict. And that's really where a lot of people stop. They don't go much beyond that concept. I'd like to take it deeper and introduce another idea, and that is that what's driving the conflict is the needs that people have. And this image of the iceberg is very intentional here. It's to encourage you to think about the issues at the surface. They're the top of the iceberg, are the things that you can see. It's the problem or the issues that we just talked about a moment ago. But what's underneath the surface? And that's where needs come into play. Needs really answers the question, why do people care about the conflict? What are we concerned about? And we're going to delve into this concept in more depth in a moment, but I'm just introducing you to the kind of the high-level version of it here. So the last thing to consider, and the last part of the triangle, is the process. And the process is important as well. It answers the question, how do we manage the conflict that we are finding ourselves in? And people tend to ignore this piece and focus more perhaps again on the problem or even trying to get their needs met. But we don't often look intentionally at the idea of how we deal with the conflict. And this can be very important. I've done cases where people have won in a court setting and won, even hundreds of thousands of dollars in court, but you go back and you ask those folks years later, would you do it again? And the answer almost invariably is no, I would not go through that process again. It was invasive, it was upsetting, it was adversarial, it destroyed any connections with the people they used to have and work with. So these are people that won. Imagine how people feel when they lose through that forum. My point here, of course, is that how we deal with the conflict matters and needs to be kind of an intentional part of our reflection on good conflict management. So here's all parts put together. The needs, the process, and the substance gives you a sense of the overall kind of architecture of good conflict resolution. So as I mentioned, I want to drill down into those needs a bit further and help you consider how that's an important aspect of conflict resolution. So here are a list of common needs. These are things that people care about in conflict. And the list has lots of different concepts, but I think you can all relate to these things and think about the conflicts that you've encountered and how these are the underpinnings of all of those conflicts that you have had to handle in your life. Conflict, this is, as I mentioned, kind of the filter or the goggles that you put in place. And when you look at a conflict at the surface, it looks like it's one thing. So let's go back to my kind of quick list of examples, people talking about communication with each other. So they might say, one colleague might say to another, I don't like the tone with which you're speaking to me, and you seem to be ignoring me now. You're not talking to me. I had a case not long ago where that was what was going on. One of the parties said, you used to give me information. You used to talk to me, but now you've been cutting me out. You haven't been providing me information, not responding to my emails. And so she was quite concerned about that. And so she was pressed harder and pushed harder and went around him and asked his boss for information. So the conflict in that regard kind of spins out of control, and people get real fixated on information or no information. What we know, looking at this slide and this concept of interest, is that there's a deeper driver, and a good conflict resolver asks the question, why? So why is it important to her to have communication from her colleague? Why is it important that he not cut her out, that he be responsive to her concerns? And if you look at this list, you might find some items here that come to mind. So it might be about her competence. So she can't do her job, she can't be competent if she's not getting the information she needs to be effective. It might be about some power. And I want to emphasize when we talk about power here that we're talking about the good kind of power, like the power to be able to take care of yourself, to do what you need to do to get your job done. So it's a positive conception of power, not that negative one to make somebody do something they don't want to do. So there's these different ideas, and you might be any one of these. It might be a combination of these, or it might be something else entirely. This is not a complete list of needs that we have. My point is, and the overarching message on this concept is that in every conflict you've had, there's what appears to be the problem, and then there's why you really care about it. And again, a good conflict resolver asks the question, why? Why does she care about getting information? And if you can start having that conversation, then you can radically transform the conflict from one kind of binary option where either he's going to give her information or not give her information. But if you change the conversation and you start saying, well, what is the real driver here? She wants to be competent. Then you can start having a conversation about what it would take for her to be competent, for her to be respected by him. We find out what his needs are, his underlying concerns, and you can change the conversation from that kind of binary yes-no option of him giving information or not to a much richer conversation about how they can both be competent in their job, how they both can have some power and control over how they're doing their work. So it's a very powerful concept, and I'm going to give you some punchlines here in a moment to underscore the real key concerns and issues that needs bring to the surface. But first, I want to do a 90-second version of the same thing I've been describing. And this is kind of a shorthand way of thinking about it. I'd like you to take a look at that nice stack of bills there. And as you see that stack of bills, I'd like to have you imagine me coming along and tearing all that money up or putting it in a shredder. That's $10,000 and I'm ripping it up right in front of you. I know that's many of you are probably aghast at this point at this idea of seeing all that money ripped up. And that's kind of my point. I want to shock you a little bit and get you to think about it. But what I'm done here is I've taken a stack of money, which is really just a stack of paper, and I've ripped it up. And yet you have kind of an emotional reaction to that. You have a strong gut level reaction of negativity towards that idea of tearing up this roll of paper. And you know, I could argue back. Well, you know, it's just it's not all that colorful. It's been touched by hundreds of people. Usually they're crinkled and creased and worn out. So what I would argue is that you're not reacting to me tearing up the piece of paper. You're reacting to what I'm doing when I really, the need that has been affected by you. I've attacked an underlying need, in other words. So what does money represent to us, is the question. And as you look at that stack of bills and you think about the list that I showed you earlier, the need that money represents is actually very deep for us. It comes to issues like those you're seeing on the screen now. If I have money, it's because society says what I'm doing has value, and so I'm going to give some money to you. That's affirmation of what we do. So I ripped up affirmation. We get money because we go to school, we learn, we work hard at our jobs, and we have achievement. So we get money So therefore, I'm ripping up achievements. The control and the power, the choice to live where you want to live, to do what you want to do in your free time, take care of your family, basic needs, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all the things that money actually represents to us. And what I'm suggesting to you all is that money, and this is a shorthand way of thinking about needs. Every conflict you've been in, it looked like it was about one thing. It looked like it was about communication or money or noise or something else, but it was really being driven by these deeper drivers. And so how do we use this in actual conflict resolution? I'd like to share with you some thoughts here. 4 different ideas that will help you kind of transform how you talk about conflict. First thing to recognize is that the needs are all positive and they're valued by everybody in conflict. So if you look at the list that I showed you earlier about those different concepts, even if you and I are in a huge disagreement about how we're going to get the job done, or whether or not we're going to have weekly staff meetings, or how we're going to deal with the fact that you went behind my back and went to my boss on something, we're going to have a real hard time getting to see each other's perspective unless we start to convert the conversation to this idea of needs. And once you start looking at needs, then you can see that both sides actually can value the needs of the other person. So I might disagree quite violently with your decision to go behind my back and talk to my boss, but if that was an issue of, for me, it's an issue of consideration or respect, you're going to have a hard time saying to me, I don't care about your need for consideration, or I don't care about your need for respect. That's a very difficult thing to have anybody say to somebody else. And folks, I get the worst conflicts organizations produce, and I very rarely have people attack each other at that level. So it's really this second concept that I'm talking about, which is that positions are very easy to refute. It's, again, kind of a binary option. Yes, I can do this, or no, I can't. You should do that, or you shouldn't do this. So that's easy to take those stances and fight with each other all day long on that. But needs are very hard to deny. So as I just illustrated for you, even in the worst cases I get, people don't say, I don't care about your need for security, or I don't care about your need for autonomy. That's a very rough and unlikely conversation for people to have. So you can really transform the process and the conflict resolution options if you do that, which brings us to our third value of looking at interests and the needs. And that is that there are just a couple of ways to resolve the position, but there are many ways to solve the need. So what I was just suggesting to you all is that there's this binary option. You only have a couple of ways to decide if somebody can go past you and go to your boss or not. I'll give you an example of another case I handled. It was an employee who was a high performer, very vigorous, did lots of things and lots of ideas. And he was one of these folks that took seriously upper management's open door policy. So he was actually going to the boss upstairs and saying, hey, I have some ideas on how to improve our work performance and how to improve our procedures and policies. And he did this with some regularity, of course, making his immediate supervisor kind of nervous. And so from the supervisor's point of view, this employee was way out of his job description, was doing things that seemed to her quite inappropriate, and it was really damaging to their relationship. So if you look at it from a position's point of view, and what he was saying was, you're a bottleneck, supervisor. You're in the way. You're not letting me do my thing. And I have these ideas. You're shutting me down, and you need to get out of the way so I can get my ideas to upper management. And of course, the manager and the supervisor in this case is saying, well, you're out of line. You're inappropriate. You keep bypassing me. You're not communicating with me, etc. So if we look at it just from a positional point of view, there's really two options here. He can either be allowed to go to upper management, or he's going to be shut down. If we think about it, though, from an interest perspective, then that can radically change the scenario here. If we look at it from her point of view, what are her needs as a manager? If you think about her needs as a manager, her needs are quite valid. She has a need for control, to have information, to know what he's doing, to feel like he's respecting her as his manager. So there's lots of valid things that he has in mind. And what are his needs? Well, he also has valid needs. Again, these are all positive, and the interests that he has are things like he wants to be respected for his ideas. He wants to be valued for what he can bring to the organization. He wants to feel like he has some autonomy and control over his work world as well. So again, all of these things are positive, and if we change the conversation from the negative, yes, you can go to upper management with your ideas, to no, you can't, we change that conversation, then we can really fundamentally transform the conversation. So this is kind of the punchline on all of this. What I'm suggesting to you all is that if we reveal what the interest is, then we can convert the conversation from one of loggerheads, kind of two people colliding and not getting anywhere, to a very different approach to working out the conflict. So let's take my example of the case that I just described to you all. If you think about that, by the time I got the case as a mediator, somebody was about to be fired. Somebody was going to lose their job over this situation. When we started working together and these interests came out on the table, these underlying drivers and needs, and we started asking, why is this important to you? Well, think about it, again, from his perspective. He wanted to have autonomy and some control, he wanted to be respected for his ideas, etc., and she had her needs as well. So once the conversation was converted to that dimension and we had that conversation, they were able to come up with a very constructive and collaborative approach. I'll just tell you what happened. Basically, he and she agreed that on a monthly basis, it was twice a month, they would get together. Any ideas he had that he had generated during that period of time, he would have written them down. He would highlight the ones that he thought were really particularly important and helpful. He would present those to her. She would work with him to enhance the ideas and discuss yes and no's and maybes and just refine the list a bit. And then she agreed to carry forward some of the ideas that he had with his name still attached to them. So if you think about that, I'm of course giving you kind of the shorthand version of this, but if you think about that, did his need get met in that scenario? Did her need get met? And I would answer yes in both cases, that he got his need for some recognition, some additional control, and a feeling that he could provide some input. And of course, she got similar things. She got a need for her need for control, her need to feel like she was able to manage her employee effectively. So all those things were accomplished in that approach to this conflict resolution scenario. So on page 3 in your materials, you'll see a list of the things that I just described. So with that in mind, we're going to give you some additional tools then to put in place to help you be successful in your conflict management. I, at this point, often get asked about the kinds of skills that are required to be effective at this. And there's really one key concept that I want to share with you all, and it's at the bottom of your page 3 in your materials. And it's this idea that really the best thing you can do to be a great conflict resolver is just to be curious. And what I'm suggesting to you all is that you can take classes, you can go to seminars and learn a lot about different active listening skills, but in my experience, most people already know how to do all of those things. You know, we know to summarize, we know to attend and look like we're listening. We need to repeat back what people have shared with us. We need to ask clarifying questions, etc. We really know all of those skills. But what I find is most difficult for my clients is to actually tap into the authentic curiosity that is within everybody in the face of conflict. I just think that people are very good at hiding this fact. You are actually already curious about what the other person is saying. It's why you find them so infuriating. How could they not see it my way? How could they have that perspective? How could they have such a different and of course in our minds incorrect and mistaken perspective? How can that be? So instead of actually projecting and working with that curiosity, we just layer it over with anger and frustration, and we get frustrated with the other person. So what I'm encouraging you all to do is to make a conscious decision in the face of conflict to tap into the curiosity that you already have, to wonder, just like this pug here that we're looking at, to wonder what's going on for them, why, and to start asking those questions. And that's the doorway into interest and to finding out what's really going on for them. And once you do that, then you reap all of the benefits of interest that we just reviewed. The idea that you can find out what their interests are, that they're positive, that you can fundamentally alter the conversation from a negative to a more constructive one. For me, it's kind of like the golden rule versus another rule. I'm sure you all know the golden rule, which is to do unto others as you do unto yourself. If you think about that from a listening perspective, though, it doesn't quite stack up. And there's actually a better rule that I'll share with you in just a moment. But I think of this as golden listening. Listening is we listen until we understand what the other person's saying. And the problem with that is we listen just long enough so that we get it, and then we say, okay, well, I understand it. And what happens usually when we get to that point? Once we get to that point, we usually say, well, I get it, so now we can move on. Or, I understand it, so here's what you should do, person B. That's really not an effective level. It's not the kind of deeper, more vigilant listening that we need to do in the face of conflict. What I would advise you all to do instead is kind of apply the platinum rule. And the platinum rule is do unto others as they would have done unto themselves. So the platinum rule of listening, to build the bridge back to listening, is to listen until the speaker feels heard. To listen at a level where they really get a chance to feel like they understand the situation better from their perspective. And so it's a much higher standard of listening than the one that we typically apply. Now, of course, this is difficult. This is not easy what I'm suggesting to you. I'm saying that in conflict situations with other people, whether you're in the mix yourself or you're trying to help other people deal with their conflict, the standard to which we should hold ourselves and that we can be more effective is to listen and then apply the skills that I mentioned a moment ago, such as summarizing what they're saying, making sure we understand, asking good questions, going deeper, all of that so that they can understand their own perspective better. If you kind of apply that standard, then you'll be much more effective in the management of conflict situations than if you just kind of stay at the surface level. So that's all I'm going to give you about active listening, again, because I think that we know that stuff, and it's really the one thing that my clients would be most successful at, and would probably put me out of a job, frankly, is that if they all decided before they came to my conflict resolution mediation sessions, if they just decided to be genuinely curious and to really tap into that and listen to what the other person's saying, that alone would resolve many of the conflicts that I end up mediating as a professional mediator. All right, so there's another concept that I want to share with you all to help you operationalize this concept. And by the way, just to pause and back up for one moment, the concept that I was just explaining to you and sharing with you, this idea of being genuinely curious, there's an article in your materials at the last page of your materials called Why Active Listening Stinks, and it kind of touches on the same concept we were just discussing. All right, so next thing I'd like to share with you all is the idea of how to operationalize those needs that we talked about. So you understand the concept, the need to be reflective and hear what they're saying. I'd like to take it one step further and actually give you a skill that will be useful in how you convert the conversation from those positions and that bumping heads over at the surface of the iceberg down to the get up and dredge and work with those deeper issues, the 97% of the iceberg that's below the surface. So I'd like to imagine somebody describing a conflict situation to you. And you think about how they talk about what's going on. I suspect, if you're honest, most of us talk about what we don't like, what we don't want, what the other person's doing wrong, what they should change. So we talk about it in very negative terms, what the other person is doing wrong. And rarely do we talk about what we actually want, what we prefer, what we see as a constructive, potential, better approach. So those are the kinds of things that people don't say. So it's almost like an Aikido master here who's, you can see on the frame here, people attacking each other. And the question is, how do we usually deal with it? The way we usually deal with it is by hitting back, or of course running away. So those are the two options that we kind of default to. Either we fight back verbally, of course, with somebody coming at us on a conflict situation, or we attack back, or we run away, I'm sorry. So if we just do those two things, then we really don't have an opportunity to stay with the conversation and to improve the scenario. What this concept I'm introducing for you all is this idea of reframing. And as I said here, it's casting a negative statement into a more neutral or a needs-based approach. So rather than just fighting back, we try to convert the conversation into a more constructive approach. So I'm going to give you an example here of a statement that you might have somebody say in a work setting, based on a case I did as mediator. So the person said, Juan is out of control. All he does is spy on me all day, and I don't know how he gets any work done. So as you think about that idea of somebody blurting this out, it has all the attributes of what I was just talking about, right? That they're attacking, they're saying what people are doing wrong. If you think about the retort to this, imagine the response is, well, what are you talking about? You know, Juan's a great employee. He was employee of the year last year, for crying out loud. And so I don't know what you're talking about. He's not spying on you. You're paranoid, etc. I'm overstating all of this for the effect of it, but I hope you get the sense that that's how a lot of conflicts actually unfold. One person says something, the other kind of retorts and tries to shout down and shut down what the other person's saying. So that conversation, I would like to think, is kind of a go-nowhere conversation that's going to get stuck. They're going to fight, and if we just stay stuck there, we're not going to make much progress. So the reframe, going back to this concept of a reframe, is to take the negative statement and to turn it into a more positive or potentially constructive idea. If you think about this and you look at the key words here, we're searching for what the interest is that's implied. So swallow the blue pill or put on your X-ray goggles and think about this from that perspective. So one thing is out of control. So there is a word right there that we've suggested is an interest-based or a needs-based word. The control is one of the concerns. Another thing, spy. So spy's on me all day long. And the third concept is, how does he get any work done? So if we're using this filter and we're seeing it from that perspective, then we might try something out. Now this one's an easier comment to deal with because it's clearly not aimed at you. The next one is, and we're going to amp it up here on the next one, but this is kind of, you can be a little more analytical because the speaker is talking about somebody other than yourself. So one thing you want to do, obviously, is acknowledge what's going on, ask questions about it. So the skill I'm about to give you is just one piece of a larger picture. So you'd certainly want to empathize and do all the things you know how to do again on, sounds like you're frustrated, acknowledging the emotion, summarizing what you think they're saying and all of that. But at some point, the reframe, the kind of Aikido move here, if you will, is to take the energy that they're sharing and then nudge it off in a more constructive direction. So you might say, after doing all the other things I just described that are good listening skills, you might say at some point, though, it sounds like being productive is important to you, and you'd like to have feel like you have more privacy in your work, in the work that you're doing. So now you see that we're extrapolating a couple of concepts here that the person's really asking for, and we start to use those concepts to reframe what it is they're really angry about. So now if we say it's we've tried that statement on them and we put a question mark on the end because we're just testing this idea. We have a hypothesis, you know, that they're really worried about productivity and their privacy. So if we say that and they say yes, I don't feel like I get the privacy that I need, or I don't feel like we're as productive as we can be because of the distraction. Well, that's a fundamentally different conversation than if we had just gotten into a tussle over whether or not Juan was a good employee or not. That, again, is a go-nowhere conversation. The one you can get traction on is talking about how to address better productivity. So it sounds like you do care about productivity in the situation and having some privacy. Let's talk about how we can do that. What is it that Juan is doing that you feel gets in the way of being more productive. Okay, and so how can you both be productive? Do you think he cares about productivity? Probably the answer is yes. You can kind of see where this is going then, hopefully, that you have that conversation, which is much more productive and constructive than the other. Let's take a look at another example. This one kind of aimed at you. I'm not going to give you the answer. First, I'm going to get you to think about it. So I'll read it for you. I do my part, but other people on the team, including you, aren't pitching in and giving this project the attention that it deserves. So you think about that, and it's happened to you in the moment here. Somebody's jabbing their finger at you and saying this. What might our kind of fight back instinct be? It might be, what do you mean I'm not doing my part? You know, who made you so special? Who elected you king? You know, you don't have a right to tell me what I'm doing or not doing. You're not setting the priorities here. You're a colleague, not my boss. So those are the kinds of retorts that you might have that, again, actually aren't going to be all that productive or helpful. Instead, if we put on the goggles here and look at it, try to figure out what's the real underlying concern here, what's the need that's being expressed. And we need to be a little humble about this. We don't know for sure what their need is, and I'm only giving you a teeniest little snapshot of probably a much larger conversation in a much broader context. But for our purposes, you look at this and you might think, well, the real issue here for this person might be about teamwork or inclusion or productivity, again, might be another issue. So those different concepts that we can kind of grope for a little bit and say, well, so it seems like you really want us to work more cohesively as a team. Is that what you're really saying? And they might say, yes. So now you can talk about cohesion. So what would it take for us to be a more cohesive team? How can we be more productive? And as I hope you can see at this point, that's a conversation that's going to be very productive, and you're going to make a lot of traction and make a lot of headway on. So that's the power of turning the interest and how to get there is this concept of interest to help you get there. So I'm going to do a little wrap up here, and then I'm going to invite any questions that you all might have so we can wrap up with some questions from you all. So the grand finale here is just to summarize the things that we've done together and talked about. The key initial concept is the idea that conflict ain't so bad after all. That was one of my goals to work with you all today, is that you might take a different perspective on conflict and recognize that it doesn't have to be destructive. In fact, it can be quite productive if we take a different attitude into the conflicts that we encounter. So there's all those benefits of conflict that we talked about: increasing awareness of the problem, incentives for change, strengthening relationships, and et cetera. And then we recognize that conflict itself has interdependence in a relationship, that people we end up in conflict with are the ones we actually depend on and rely on and work with, and we need each other. So that's kind of a radical revision of the way we usually think about the people that make us mad. And then we looked at the three dimensions in conflict: the positions that people take, the needs that they have, those things that we've really spent most of our attention on because it's not the most obvious part of conflict. And then we also talked about the process for dealing with the conflict. So the way that we deal with the conflict, again, is important. And then we looked at the needs. We discussed how needs come into play, some of the different dimensions and concepts that are common in conflict and workplace settings. So gave you a list of samples. Then we used some tools to unearth the conflict and kind of reframe and change the conversation using that reframing. And finally talked about curiosity and being authentically curious, so rising from the golden listening where we get it to the platinum listening where we try to understand it from their perspective and help them be more clear. So that's a walkthrough on constructive conflict resolution. That's some key tips from my experience on how to fix workplace conflict, and I'm happy to take questions and hear other thoughts from you all. So Brenda, for that, you're going to take a look at questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Let's see, it looks like we have one question posted. Let me just get up here to the top. Okay, what if both parties have needs, but only one effectively knows how to meet the needs of the other party through these techniques, but the other person is not interested in your needs. That is what I deal with on a regular basis.
Sure. Well, it sounds like a discouraging scenario to be in, where you feel like you're reaching out and trying to recognize the needs of the other person, and you're not getting the ball bounced back to you. So I can certainly see how that's a frustrating scenario. And yet, what I would suggest is that the approach to conflict that I've described here is ultimately a better approach because it produces better outcomes. If you think about the scenario I was describing with the supervisor and the employee, where the employee was bypassing the manager, that was not going to end well for either of those folks if they continued down that route. What they were able to do was have a better outcome, one where they had actually more work together, they had more information exchange, and they improved their overall working relationship, which also, by the way, improved how they look to others in their organization and their overall effectiveness. So what I'm suggesting here is that by rigorously pursuing the needs and continuing to focus on that, regardless of whether the other person's bouncing the ball back, will produce a better outcome. So that's one thing. It's kind of the proof is in the pudding deal. Another is that these are not soft skills in the sense of, I'm not encouraging you all to be doormats here, that you only kind of worry about their needs, and if they don't worry about your needs at all, then you just let them do that. So I'm certainly not encouraging you to allow people to steamroll you. But what I am saying is that by shifting the conversation over to needs, you can fundamentally change how you all end up talking about the needs of yours and the other person. So let's say, for example, that the supervisor in the case I described to you was very effective at this and said, I see, employee, that you need to have some input and be respected for your contributions to the organization. But the employee, when it's his turn, he just keeps harping on, well, you're a bottleneck, and you don't let me talk to the upper management folks, and you're in the way, and you're not helping your employees be effective and do everything they can do. Well, she then, by switching over to the needs conversation, has put herself in a position where she can be very assertive then and say, well, you know what, Fred, let's call him Fred, I just described the needs that I think you have, and I shared some of my needs, but every time I try to ask you to take a look at my needs, all you do is you just keep attacking me on the positions again. You just keep kind of hammering on the same position over and over again. But that's not what I did for you, and I didn't do that, and I really want you to show that you can do the same thing that I've done, that you can demonstrate an understanding of my underlying needs. Now, regardless of how you phrase this, the point I'm wanting to make to you all, and the person that asked this question, is that you gain some power, you gain leverage, and frankly, it's there's a contagion effect here. The more you do it, and the more assertive you are in doing it and holding to it, the more likely it is you'll be able to draw the other person into that same conversation around needs. So hopefully that's helpful in responding to your question. Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you. Looks like we have time for one more question. So do you have any tips for keeping your cool during conflict?
Sure. That's a tough one, and it's a challenge for everybody. I think one of the things I encourage my clients and people in trainings to consider is what we lose if we don't stay cool in conflict. So there's two key concepts that I would highlight. And one is about control. How much control are you willing to give to the other person? And if we aren't keeping our cool, if we're just reacting and responding to what they say, then we're really handing the steering wheel over to the other person. We're saying, here you go, you go ahead and drive this conversation. You're in charge now. So that's one thing, is that you lose control. The way to regain control, of course, is to do the skills that we've been talking about. Ask good questions, go for the interests, go for the needs, understand what's really going on. So that's one key thing to consider when you're trying to remain cool. The other thing is to think about, what's your purpose in the conversation? What is it that you really want to achieve in any given situation that you might find yourself in? That's something that gets tossed out the window pretty quick when we lose our cool in conflict. We end up just in a shouting match or an argument with somebody. And what we lose in the process is what we really need to accomplish. So again, this is focused on workplace settings. So what's the organizational purpose? What's your goal or your mission in your work in a given situation? That's what you should be focused on. And if you're allowing them to take control, then you're also going to veer off into some other place that's not effective in terms of your purpose. So it's just kind of the intentionality of it not getting triggered. And the last point I'll make here in just 10 seconds is this idea of staying curious. There's a reason I said that's the only skill I'm going to give you today in terms of good listening, is to really just stay curious. And if you can tap into that curiosity, then it's a powerful device that will help you deal with conflict. So I believe we're at time. Brenda, anything else before we wrap up?
We are, yeah. It looks like we're out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up. But we can answer any other questions by email following the webinar.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all. Appreciate your participation today. Hope it was gained some additional insights, and this meeting is adjourned.